After the success of Chavoris, I knew my next conlang idea had to be amazing. And, I know what you guys want to see, so the answer is obvious. Here's Prosian, an example of how to make your own Indo-European language. So, unlike a regular conlang, you don't have to start from scratch. An Indo-European language is one that's descended from Proto-Indo-European, which has been plenty fleshed out by historical linguists. You don't have to come up with a phonology, morphology, and semantics. You just have to create the rules for how those things have changed since Proto-Indo-European. The tricky part is making them realistic. You don't want to suffocate the language, make it into nonsense, or leave it unaffected. There's a balance. So, what better example is there than the language I'm speaking? English. How did Proto Indo European become English? There are 100 sound changes that we can confidently say turned Proto Indo European into English, or at least up to when British and American split up. Now, obviously, I can't get into all of those, but especially when I have to go over the ones I created for Prosian, but we can do an example so you can get a feel for them. Let's start, as we always do in Proto-Indo-European, with a root. Perd, to be tall or ascend. Next, of course, we add on a suffix to form a lemma. The suffix is os, which forms a noun that means what you get when you do something. It doesn't do anything weird, so this ablouts normally to E grade. Our finished project is pertos. So let's make it into English. Now, as you can tell by acute, the G is what we call a palatovelar, which isn't going to last long. The very first change is going to eliminate it somehow. English is what we call a kentum language, so its solution is to remove the acute. This sound change merges the palatovelars and plain velars, leaving the next form as percos. We skip through 11 more changes that don't apply to this word before we reach the big one. I don't care if you learn anything else from this video, you have to know the granddad of the Germanic sound changes, Grimm's Law. Grimm's Law is what finally eliminated those pesky breathy voiced consonants, so you can all stop complaining about my pronunciation. Those sounds ba-da-ga-gwa became ba-da-ga-gwa, which became pa-ta-ka-kwa, which became fa-ta-ha-hwa. So the new spelling is Bergos. Now, that's not the whole story. There's a second box here for voiced fricatives. These are technically the same as the voiced plosives. This is how they're pronounced in the middle of the word. A more accurate pronunciation would be Bergos. Now, if Grimm's Law is the granddad of Germanic sound changes, the grandma is Werner's Law. Those new fricatives we just created, and the leftover ones from Proto-Indo-European, they also get a chance to dip into this box. Specifically, whenever an unstressed vowel occurs before a voiceless fricative, it turns into a voiced fricative, even if they're separated by a sonorant. Eagle-eyed viewers will spot that that's exactly the situation the final S is in. The next stage is Bergos. Hey, you know how A and O are separate sounds? Screw that. Our next one also has a lame name because it's the merger of non-high back vowels, whether they're short, long, or extra long. O and A merged together into aw. This is written with an A, but it's not the same A as before. Our next stage is Bergaz. Okay, stop! We have now officially reached Proto-Germanic. Now, some of you may be wondering, what's so special about here? We've made tons of significant changes, not to mention the other branches have also been deriving. Why only now is it a different language? Well, as linguists love to bring up, language is constantly evolving. We have to draw a line somewhere, and unless there's something like, I don't know, an invasion that forever changes the course of a language, there's always going to be a gradient between the two. That being said, the reason we choose now is because this is when Germanic splits. We'll, of course, follow the branch that includes English to Proto-West Germanic. Even though it doesn't affect this word, I would be remiss if I didn't point out the Germanic umlaut. When languages change, they tend to make sense why they change. One of the most prominent reasons is called vowel harmony. Vowels like to be similar to the vowel in front of them. That can range from, hey, can you guys be slightly more fronted, to you'll be a back vowel and you will like it. Another point umlaut illustrates is that languages like to be similar to one another. The point of a language is to communicate with other people, after all. The umlaut hit all Germanic languages even after they had diverged. Now I'm missing it. Oh yeah, I forgot to explain what umlaut actually is. Well, before E or Y, O and U became E and Y, A became A, and E became E. But like I said, that doesn't affect this word. Remember how I pronounced it Bergaz? Well, that's not quite accurate. I try not to be finicky about the pronunciation when it doesn't matter, but we know that this Z isn't a normal Z. It was some sort of weird, janky palatal sound like Ra. We know this because if it was Z, it would be treated like the other voiced fricatives, but it wasn't. Now, Old Norse scholars will notice that this weird sound is kind of similar to the R sound that occurs at the end of like half of all Old Norse nouns. That's because it's descended from it, which is descended from the Proto-Indo-European os, which was a really common noun-forming suffix. But that's Norse. In West Germanic, it got chopped off. Just berga it is. But hey, you know that new a sound we just invented during the umlaut? We think it's way cooler than the ah, so we would like it to be the new a. Not in all cases. Vowel harmony lets it stay as ah if it's right before a back vowel, but this one isn't, so berga. Although that's a moot point. One sound change later, and we've chopped off all those open vowels when we're at the end of a word. Berg it is. Congratulations, we made it to Proto-West Germanic. So, you know how I pronounce it, ra? Well, it's assumed that when before a consonant, it becomes ra, with constriction around the velum. The same is true for l, and h needs no help being velar. Now, this velar place is also where the back vowels like u and o live, but a is a front vowel, so to comfortably get from one to another, it needs an inserted back vowel. It becomes ew for berg. Next up is another big one, diphthong height harmonization. The two halves of a diphthong or changing vowel want to stay in the same position in terms of openness, so the open e drags the close u down to the open o. Berg, and we can drop the asterisk because this is attested in Old English inscriptions. English actually had a second umlaut, and now they have diphthong smoothing. Berg emerges from the smoothing of erg, and then it unrounds again. Three times! 3 times we've had the sound I emerge, and 3 times we've unrounded it to E. Why? It's such a cool sound. Whatever. Berg. Now, you know that weird G that isn't quite a G sound, r? Well, if you round your lips, it becomes w, and if you kick it forward, it becomes y. Those two sound much nicer, right? So which one do we do? Well, next to a front vowel, y, next to a back vowel, w. In this case, w is the default. Ber. Well, come on. You can't end a word with r. We'll add an extra syllable and insert the most central vowel that can occur before w. That's an o for Barrow. Next up, oh, you already know what's about to happen. It's your boy, the Great Vowel Shift. Unfortunately, the Great Vowel Shift only affects long vowels. These are all short vowels. Their leader is the GVS's sidekick, the Middle English diphthong loss. That new O merges with the existing O, sometimes called the to-to merger. That gives us Barrow. Now, you may notice that up until this point, it hasn't sounded English. That's about to change. Ra just turned into That means Barrow. And what's more, the long O becomes the familiar O. And that leaves us where we are today. Barrow. It's an obscure synonym for mountain. It's hard to find a good example in a language where most vocabulary is borrowed from a different branch. There's only one problem. Shouldn't this be pronounced burrow? That's a short E. There was a rule I skipped over where became and it isn't even a, it's a. So what gives? Did I really lie just for my own benefit? Well, I didn't lie. Barrow is a great example, but perhaps its best example is by being a poor example. These are the rules. They tell the sound in its letters how to change. But we didn't tell that to turn into a. It did that on its own. Linguistic evolution tries to be controlled by rules, but the most important rule is that humans are pattern seeking. Think of every word you can that ends in uro. Basically, the only example is burrow, and that was pronounced with an oo at that time. But think about words ending in arrow. There's plenty, including one that literally is barrow. This word, which still exists as wheelbarrow, is from a completely different root, but the pattern seeking of rule -1 forces them together, and so we got an unpredictable shift. Morphology also shifts, as alluded to in the video. We spent long enough without talking about how I actually made a conlang, so let's go back to Prosian. Like in a lot of Proto-Indo-European languages, I chopped out the dual number because why do we need a difference between two and more than two? And also the optative because why do we need a distinction between this might happen and I'm rooting for it, and this might happen and I'm indifferent towards it? I'll use the imperfective and aorist for present and past, so we can remove the imperfective past-present distinction. Also, why do we need a case for when you're talking to something? We'll use the accusative for that. Also, ablative is way cooler than locative. I'll cut out the locative. Actually, when you're using the locative for motion, then the ablative replaces it. Otherwise, the dative replaces it. And we'll cut out the genitive. I kind of had the idea for this language that it moved with the Persian languages, but then it went east all the way over the Tibetan plateau into China, so A, the people call themselves the ones who walk, pros, hence the name Prosian, and B, it's heavily influenced by Chinese, so it's written using Hanzi, and instead of using a genitive case, I'll use the Asian particle system to show ownership instead of a genitive. I'll also cut out the neutral gender. Feminine is for final stressed words, and masculine is for words with stress on other syllables. Now, stress is going to change over the course of a language, so I have to say when the neutral is dropped out. Now, morphological concept can be added to what we call innovations, although this is difficult and rare. I can innovate a future tense by first appending the imperfect subjunctive and then the infinitive of the relevant mood. And finally, semantic shift. Words change the way they're being used. The Proto-Germanic drago, which meant drag, now specifically means to drag a tool over a surface to create an image. Drag, which was loaned from Norse, still maintains the original meaning. So I know I haven't actually discussed that much about Prosian, but I've laid the necessary groundwork to do an example. I could do something simple, but Proto-Indo-European already does so much of the work for me. Let's go with 6 vexed boxers quickly danced around the well. The Proto-Indo-European numerals are pretty well fleshed out. The word for 6 is swex. Ablaut to swex. Flip a coin, heads, we keep the S. Rule number 15, the stressed vowel is lengthened. Swex. Rule number 27, long vowel shift. Sweeks. Rule number 29, long vowel shorten. Sweeks. Rule number 36, W loses velarization next to a front vowel and instead becomes ra, which is the labial ra. Sreeks. Rule number 37, breakdown of length distinction. Short I becomes yeah. Sreeks. And rule number 38, combination of approximates. Rya becomes ya, and by that same rule, that all combines with a sa to form sheks, and from then on, no further changes. The Prosian numeral 6 is pronounced sheks. Oh my gosh, that was a rush. I'm literally trembling as I write this. Let's do another one, vexed. In English, the word vexed is a participle, meaning it's technically a form of a verb that means having had vexing done to it. The Proto-Indo-European equivalent for this would be tos, as you can imagine. So the word I'm using for vex is going to be mers. Mers is actually closer to ignore or neglect, but I can use a new word like not care for that. Alright, so we're referring to boxers. The suffix for boxers forms masculine nouns, and it's the subject of the sentence. The suffix for that inflection is toes, shoving the mrs into zero grade, and altogether it's mrstoes. Now, there's a conversation to be had here. Not all quote-unquote unpredictable sound changes are truly unpredictable. Words like to be similar to their lemmas, the uninflected dictionary form. There was a rule in Middle English that swore was to be pronounced as so. Sword became sword. Answer, which was pronounced answor at this point, became ansor, but swore stayed as swore. Why? Because its lemma is swear. This happens across English, but it's not a universal rule. Words like thought separated from their lemmas, and so it shall be with mrstoes. Rule number 6. Sta and a bunch of other consonant clusters all shortened to tsa. Mrtsoes. Rule number 8, vowels lengthen at the end of a syllable in open syllable. Mrtsoes. Rule number 11, length moves from a stressed syllable onto a following short, unstressed syllable. Mrtsoes. Rule number 13, S disappears at the end of a word when it comes after a long vowel. Mrtsoe. Rule number 15, stressed vowel lengthens. Mrtsoe. Rule number 27, long vowel shift. O becomes A and E becomes E. Mrtsai. Rule number 29, long vowels shorten. Mrtsai. Rule number 37, length distinction collapses. Short A becomes schwa, short I becomes ye. Mrtsaye. Rule number 44, stress moves to the first syllable unless the word is really long. Mrtsaye. Rule 45 says that final E disappears, and Rule 46 says that unstressed schwa disappears. Mrts. But Rule 47 preempts your complaints that final ya turns into E. Mrtsi. And that's how it stays all the way up until the present mrtsi. Yeah, I kept the syllabic R. I think it looks cool. For boxers, on the other hand, I'm going to split them up into box and ers and then combine them at the end. It's not language without a little irregularity. The root for hit, strike, or fist fight is peud, which became pugilism in Latin. And whoa, 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 whoa! Do not put that through Grimm's Law. Anyway, the suffix for the thing that does a verb is tus in nominative, and the things that do a verb is tewes. Ready, let's make. Rule 15, lengthen the stressed vowel, peud. Rule 25, o and a became e. It's a beautiful sound. We stand the letter e. Peud. Rule 28, we drop final voiced consonants, peu. And regrettably, Rule 67, o becomes o. So we end up with peu, but that just means to box. Here's the other half. Tewes becomes tewes by Rule 8, which lengthens vowels in open syllables, but Rule 17 then uses that length to elongate the consonant, forming tewes. But you remember Rule 25, that O's gotta be an O. Tewes. Rule 26, the short vowel shift turns E into E, so tewis. Rule 36 turns the wa into ra next to a front vowel, teuris. Rule 37 breaks the E into ye, teuries. Then clever Rule 38 combines the ra and ya into ya for teus, and it stays that way until Rule 61 switches out the o for o. This merges into a geminated ya, and teus is the translation of which combines with to box to form peuteues. You like that u with umlaut and breathe? Now, the splitting up of languages is not a quick and painless process. The languages have to disentangle slowly while sound changes continue to happen, affecting them unevenly. You can't just Irish goodbye out of PIE, you need to make a few common changes. The word I've chosen for quickly is heng. This technically means light, but the Indo-Iranian languages repurposed it as quick, and Prosian is going to be close to them. Case in point, Rule 1 is of course satanization. The labiovelar qua becomes ka. Rule 4 turns the breathy voiced plosives into fricatives, hleng. Rule 15 lengthens the stressed vowel into hleng. Rule 19 gets rid of that danglaryngeal, leaving leng. Rule 27 is the long vowel shift, ling. Rule 28 drops final voiced consonants for just lin, and Rule 29 shortening of long vowels to lin. Rule 37 break up to lien, and Rule 38 coalescence to luen. And that's where we pick up the adverb quickly. Yeah, I know that symbol is strictly for a palatal L, but I'm not including a W when there's nothing to contrast it with. Funnily enough, the Indo-Europeans didn't have a word for to dance. The best one I could come up with is wert, which means to turn. That doesn't feel right, so I added a suffix steti, which forms a verb meaning to repeatedly perform an action. Obviously, third person plural, past indicative, and they aren't dancing an object, they're just dancing. So we use the middle voice. That ending is storor, and it puts the root into 0 grade. Rule 8 lengthens vowel in open syllables, storor. Rule 11, it shifts that length onto the following unstressed syllable, wortstoror. But then Rule 15, the stressed syllable regains length, wortstoror. Rule 22, this palatovelar shifts its palatization onto this vowel for wortstoror. Rule 24 swaps A and O when unstressed, wortskerar. Rule 27, long vowel shift, wortskerer. Rule 28, final voiced consonants are dropped, wortskere. Rule 29, long vowel shorten, wrtskere. Rule 44, stress shifts back to the first syllable, wrtskere. Rule 45, the final E disappears, wrtsker. Rule 63, affricates like tsa shorten into a fricative when not adjacent to a vowel. That gives this use of danced as wrtsker. Keeping the sound w and v separate is a very unusual choice. English and the Celtic languages are the only two groups to have done this. If you choose to do something like this yourself, don't be content with just the first batch of sound changes you create. They're not going to end up sounding good, and you'll need to update it as you get new information. I had to tamper with Prosian for about 2 months before it ended up just right. The word for around is p. It's attested in nearly every language. Rule 4 turns the p into v, vi. Rule 8 lengthens vowels in open syllables to create vi. Rule 20 eliminates the and no vowels are left to be changed by it, leaving mv. Rule 27, long vowel shift, mv. Rule 29, long vowels shorten, mv. Rule 37 breaks it up into mv. Rule 41, the syllabic nasal becomes a nasal vowel. This time it's u, forming mv. The final e is lost according to Rule 45, and then the ye becomes u according to Rule 47, forming mv. Rule 60 expels the nasal, and with no plosive to attach to, it just disappears. The final product is then uvu. The determiner the varies between languages, but I'll use the most basic so for it. The word I'm using to form well makes neutral nouns, but the word final stress will make it a feminine noun, so the feminine form of it is se. Now, in this context, the boxers are moving around the well, so it's in the locative case, descended from the PIE ablative case, so it should be tosies, but it's my language, so I can make up the rule that the determiners decline only based on gender, not case. So se is the one we go with. Rule 3 says A is pronounced as A next to H2, so sa. Rule 15 lengthens the stress syllable into sa. Rule 20 gets rid of the H2, but it also lengthens the vowel further into sa. Rule 29, instead of shortening it into a short vowel, shortens it into a regular long vowel. And Rule 37 reduces it to short A, not schwa. That gives sa as the word the. PIE doesn't have a good word for well, so I have to use a suffix. Pelk means to expand or swell, and it gives us the English words bulge and belly. M forms a noun that means the end result of. The direct meaning of the end result of swelling might be bladder, which I'll extend to mean container, then reservoir, and ultimately well. M becomes mens in ablative and ablautes the root into 0 grade, so the start is pigments. Rule 4, the breathy voiced become fricatives, vmens. Rule 15, the stressed vowel lengthens, vmens. Rule 27, the long vowel shift, vmins. Rule 29, long vowel shorten, vmins. Rule 30, walked right into that one. Rule 34 gives us the process for dealing with syllabic L, which is pronounced as O at this point. Between two consonants, it becomes U, vuimins. Rule 37, vowels break up to make voimiens. Rule 38 shifts that palatovelar into a labiopalatal, voimiens. Rule 44 moves stress to the first syllable, voimiens. Now, Rule 57, this is supposed to only affect the y sound, dropping it when it occurs after tsa or za, but language is chaos. So now it unpredictably drops the w after v. Vojmiens. Rule 65 deletes o from the language depending on the next vowel. Before an e, it becomes a. The final ablative singular of well is vajmiens. And the full translation becomes Sheks mrtsi pautaues luen wursker uvus a vajmiens.